Hello, everyone. Welcome to Coffee with Convery, where we explore stories, insights, and careers that inspire the next generation. In this special edition of Legacy and Motion Black History Month, I sit down with Dr. Camisha Sibblis, an influential leader in social justice, mental health, and Black studies. A 2024 honoree of 100 accomplished Black Canadian women and one of Canada's top 100 Black women to watch in 2022, Dr. Sibblis is an associate professor and the director of Black Studies Institute at the University of Windsor. With a background spanning academic, psychotherapy, and social work, she has dedicated her career to dismantling the systematic barriers and advocating for historical, underrepresented communities. Whether you're navigating your first job, looking to make that career shift, or seeking ways to contribute to a more inclusive society, this conversation is for you. Misha, welcome to Coffee with Convery.
Thank you for having me.
Super excited to get this conversation going. I always start with a few rapid fire questions so the audience can get to know you. What do you think is your superpower?
So I think I consider myself like sort of one of those highly sensitive people. So I think empathy is a huge superpower for me. I've always been able to feel people beyond sort of what they say. I feel the energy, I feel what they're putting out. And so, even as a child, almost clairvoyant in that, you could
Love
tell
that.
the person and who you might want to stay away from, that sort of thing. But yeah, with empathy, it's really helped me with my practice and with just really connecting with people professionally and personally.
Amazing. Talking about school, what is your favorite subject in school?
English.
English.
Favorite subject was English. I loved to write fiction. I loved to write poetry, music. So, the written word and spoken word were always really, really like just near and dear to my heart. So
Amazing. That's awesome. And we all start somewhere, right? Some people started babysitting. I started mowing lawns. What was your very first job?
Toys R Us. I
Toys
worked
R
at Toys R Us.
Us.
Yes, and I loved it.
I
I
bet.
loved it. Yeah, I remained a big kid at heart. So I walked the aisles and read all the descriptions of the toys, and everything was so cool to me. I maybe wasn't doing enough of the work, but I was enjoying myself.
That's amazing. That's cool. Did you buy a lot of the toys too?
I
Or
did. I
yeah, I was
certainly
gonna
did.
say that's a handy.
Oh yeah.
If you had to pick one word, I know this is tough sometimes, but if you had to describe yourself in one word, what would it be?
So that's a question I always grapple with because it's really hard to describe yourself in one word and not sound really hokey, like and corny, and not sound like you have this inflated sense of ego, uh,
Yeah,
trying to be a narcissist. One word, I think, what I would say is perseverant.
I like
Right?
that. Yeah.
Yeah, I've
It,
I've overcome a lot. I keep going. I'm very driven. I just keep going, probably pathologically.
That's okay. I think perseverance is great, and that's a great way to describe you. So, as I was mentioning as we're getting started, this podcast has a span of audience, thinking about various things. But one of the questions they always want to hear from the guest is, how did you get started? Like, how did you start? Where did your career journey start? Do you want to take us through a little bit of your background and kind of how you got to where you are today?
Yeah. Um, So it's really hard to sort of divorce the personal from the professional. I think that a lot of
Sure.
things happened in my personal life really sort of created the path for what I did professionally and academically and beyond. So, I was fast tracking through high school with I had a very, very tumultuous home life. My parents a lot of sort of domestic violence stuff. Parents were always fighting.
Mhm.
And I really found my refuge in school. Was able to fast track through high school. But again, oftentimes like family discordance and ultimately my parents separated and my whole home world fell apart.
Mhm.
Uh, Ended up being pregnant and having a baby at 17. Because I'd fast tracked through high school, I ended up graduating when I was supposed to anyway. I had to take some time off, then went back to school and graduated when I was supposed to. But I really, because of some of I guess the trials that I'd faced, my sights were set on being a psychologist, right? I wanted to help. I wanted to engage in therapy.
Yeah.
Um, Prior to that, as a sidebar, growing up, I wanted to be Bill Cosby. Like I wanted to be Huxtable on the Cosby Show, and he was a gynecologist, uh, an obstetrician, and I was like, how does he get to spend so much time with his family, right? But have this career, this in I just like
Interesting.
what I wanted to be. Then I realized that I couldn't really stomach the sight of blood, so I was like, okay, let me change, let me pivot a little bit.
Yeah.
Uh, so psychology, I started in psychology, ended up and it was, it was at U of T. I was doing a Bachelor of Science in Psych, learning about Skinner rats and Pavlov's dogs, and I realized this is not like I didn't. It wasn't the scientific piece of psychology that I was really attracted to. It was the clinical therapeutic pieces, right? And so I pivoted again, got into philosophy, and that's where I learned about Freud and psychoanalysis, and I was like, this is where I need to be. So it's also where I did informal and formal logic. And I was like, okay, I'm going to be a lawyer. I'm going to advocate for people. Um, and and when I was doing so I did my LSAT. And when I was doing my references for law school, one of my professors asked me just in conversation, ever hung out with any lawyers? You know any lawyers? In my past, I had some exposure to some lawyers, and he's like, "Do you feel like you see yourself amongst those people? Do you relate? Is that the kind of person that you see? I was like, actually, no, no, I do not. Um, as much as I thought that they were advocates, it wasn't really what they embodied, right? And so I was like, okay, in law, I'm not going to be able to fight for what I think is right all the time. I'm going to fight for the law, which I know law follows power and money, and it
Hmm.
doesn't necessarily follow. And so I'm like, okay, that's not what I want to do either. And he said, if you want to actually advocate and help people, have you thought about social work? And I hadn't. I didn't know what it was at the time. I was
Right.
leaving, finished my undergrad, and had no idea what social work was. So I looked into it, and I was like, yeah, I could do this. This
Yeah.
sounds in line with what I wanted to do. So I ended up doing a placement in at Children's Aid Society, and then being hired. And was a child protection worker for about 5 years. Um, and did, all sorts of like all the facets of child protection works, screening, intake, family services, um, and enjoyed the work, and then realized how problematic it was, right?
Yeah.
Given that it is, has, as many of our institutions do, has a lot of embedded systemic biases, particularly when it comes to targeting Black mothers. And so I couldn't do that work anymore. I moved out of that and went into school social work, um, and did that for almost 11 years. And during that, while I did that, I became a panelist for the Office of the Children's Lawyer, and those are people that
Oh, wow.
conduct custody and access assessments
Hmm.
because of my background in child welfare for the courts, right? So when parents separate or divorce, they need an expert to sort of interview the child, interview parents, interview other collaterals, and help the courts determine where the child should spend most of their time, who should have what access should look like, who should make certain decisions about the children, and what's in the child's best interest. And so I have done that throughout, because that's kind of contract work. Um, and and I also started a private practice doing psychotherapy, um, because I went back to school and did a postgraduate certification in hypnotherapy and also family couples and family therapy. Um, while doing that, I said, it would be great if I had I think it would lend a little more credibility to my practice if I had a doctor in front of my name. So let me go back to school and get my PhD.
That's how it happens.
That is how it happens. I need the doctor.
Yeah.
Um, so it's almost like full circle because I started off wanting to be a
Yeah.
psychologist,
Yeah.
right? But I'm a clinical psychologist, and here I am now taking a whole other path, going back to exactly what I wanted to do in the first place. So the ultimate goal was for me to build my practice and lead the school board. But while I was doing my PhD, part of your part of it is particularly in social work, part of the requirements is to teach. So I
Okay.
also had to teach for the MSW program actually in Windsor. I taught for York University, and I noticed that when I did, I had students, Black students, and particularly Black female students saying, "You're my first Black prof." Other students as well would
Wow.
really appreciate your perspective. I've never had anyone say things to me in this way or really sort of keep it real, which
Yeah.
is,
Yep.
what I do in class, even if it's uncomfortable. Um, and I
Good for
appreciate it.
you.
Yeah. So, like
Yeah.
they said validate their experiences and whatnot. And I thought about it. I looked around at my peers and my colleagues, and I'm like, I don't know if I'm your first, I'm not sure you're ever going to get this again. And I don't know who else is going to have the opportunity to have a Black prof. And so I pivoted once more and I said, I needed to be here in academia to show, number one, to validate students' experiences,
Yeah.
to be a part of that, representation matters so that they can see themselves in positions like these.
Yeah.
Um, and not only through representation, but through actual action-oriented work to actually pull them up and tell them, you need to be here. Let me help you. Let me mentor you. How do we get you in academia? Because they cannot just be the five of us, whoever they are, right? Um, so I figured that was my activism. That was my next level of,
Wow.
and here I am.
Wow. What a
Sorry, it was like
story.
long, yeah.
No, no, it's incredible. And I can imagine our listeners are just thinking through that. And just even some of the folks that might be listening, even a young Black girl is thinking about going into being a teacher or a prof or whatever, right? Like it's people like you that are, actioning through it and standing up for what's right and sharing that it can be done. And I think the representation is huge. I think that we all look for someone or someone that's like us, or maybe looks like us, right? And if we don't see it, we don't think it's achievable.
Absolutely. Exactly. And,
So,
I've partnered with a lot of, I'm involved with the Windsor Essex school boards, and I'm consistently hearing from students still, they've never had a Black teacher, they've never had a Black principal. And so they don't see themselves in those positions. And it really
wow.
impacts their experiences in school because there aren't people in those positions who understand what it's
Yeah.
like to and who can
Wow.
really integrate their experience into the curriculum.
Wow.
Yeah.
On that note, since it is Black History Month, and I want to thank you so much for joining me in this conversation. We talk about Black History Month from the achievements or reflection on progress, but I think we also need to acknowledge the ongoing struggle for equality and justice as well. What does, as you're thinking about this month, what does Black History Month mean to you? From maybe a personal and professional perspective or that intersection of both.
Yeah, I think it's pretty intersectional for me. For me, Black history is a celebration of the rich tapestry of Black culture, the resilience, and the history, right? The history that stays with us, and it's so it beautifully colors this world. Um, but personally, I'm of Jamaican heritage,
Yeah.
and so this Black History Month is particularly prideful because Jamaican-born political activist Marcus Mosiah Garvey, who first said, "Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds," before Bob Marley did. Bob Marley took it from him. He was pardoned a couple of weeks ago, right?
Mhm.
85 years after his death by President Biden on his final day in office. And so this
Wow.
is a great year for that legacy. I think, in terms of history, I know that a lot of people ask, why are we so stuck on the history? And I think, you know, history is the only way that we can really conceptualize it, but it's kind of a misnomer. Like history stays with us.
Right.
It's never really history, right? And if you think about the way that time is constructed, so there's a scholar, Canadian, well, she's a Canadian prof now. Her name is Christina Sharp, and she talks about the ways in which our individual lives are always swept up in the wake produced and determined by the afterlife of slavery, right? And we think about the wake, it's like the track left on the water's surface by a ship, right? And
Mm,
so it's a disturbed region of flow.
right.
Um, and in North America, we're all living in the wake of the slave ship, right? And so we are its past or its history just as much as it is ours. And we carry that with us. It's never truly past. And we carry it in our DNA. And
Hmm.
so and so Black history is really around it's just Black affirmation. It's like you're here, you matter, your culture is with us, all of the things that you've contributed and continue to contribute are celebrated right here and now. And that's a really important thing. Um, that's a really, really important, meaningful thing for me.
Absolutely. Beautifully said. Um, Now I'd like to jump to a little bit about you've worked extensively in mental health, particularly with young youth and marginalized communities. What are some of the key changes you'd like to see in how we approach mental health support and equity?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think
Yeah,
things I tend to lead with that people can acknowledge but don't practice, don't seem to sort of hold it with them in the practice is that mental health and illness exist on the same spectrum
right.
and it's fluid and we are
Mm,
all on that spectrum, all of us,
I love
right?
that.
Right. And
Yeah.
so we all sit somewhere on that spectrum and we move, right?
Hmm.
We move along it at various elements of our lives. So and I think why that's important is that sometimes we have this sort of binary between us and them. There's a dichotomy, right?
Yes.
I am well, they are not well. When we're all sort of the same people on the same spectrum going through this ebb and flow.
Wow. I've never heard
So
anyone explain it that way. It's really, wow, what a great takeaway. That's amazing. I never even thought of it that way myself, and it's so true. It is a
yeah,
spectrum.
yeah, absolutely.
We all deal
And
with it.
so we all deal with it. There are some of us at some times of our lives where we are like clinically depressed, right? And
Yeah.
we come out of the depression and so like we visited different elements of mental illness throughout our lives. Um, and the other pieces I think that people don't really think about is the fact that mental illness is contextual. It's
Right.
contextual based on time, based on culture, right? And so, whereas in the Western culture, we might consider somebody mad, in a different time and place, they were enlightened. They were seeing things that we weren't seeing. And so, it's how do we integrate some of those different ways of seeing people, into our ways of being that bring them back in rather than marginalize people. Um,
Yeah.
like recognizing some of the beauty in that. And I think part of the way that we do that in terms of equity is we need practitioners from other cultures uh, in critical masses that bring in those nuances and those different types of understandings so that people they can reframe people's experiences for themselves, right? Because
Yeah.
in Western culture, we are so good at sort of pushing people to the margins and normalizing certain things and
And making other things not normalized.
right,
Right.
exactly. Exactly.
Wow. Yeah,
So
that's such a great, wow, that's so good. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that wisdom.
pleasure, my pleasure. And then like I think the last thing is that
Sure.
inequality and inequity breeds mental illness and pathology. So
Yep.
you put them together in this question, like mental health support and equity, there is a causal relationship between inequity and mental illness.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It's
Wow,
important to
thank you. Thank you so much for that. Really, really good. Really good. Really, really insightful. Um, Now thinking about careers, another side segue a little bit on this podcast is so many of the listeners are, early in their careers or maybe also not looking maybe to do a bold transition to something new, maybe kind of done that, been there, done that thing. What advice do you have for those looking to forge their own paths and thinking particularly about those facing those systematic barriers?
so in terms of you know looking about forging your own path, just that it's really it's difficult to do alone, right? And
Yes.
so if you can put your efforts into finding your people, finding people that are willing to do it with you, finding people who have done it before you, finding people who are aspiring to do it and maybe a few steps behind you, and creating a bit of an army of
Hmm.
sorts. You'll go further. You'll go further, and you go faster and further, really.
Yeah,
Um, so find your people and if you can, chart your own path, sort of create your own lane together. Um, Rather than, really it's it's one thing to be successful in current systems and a whole other thing to create a system where, it is already more equitable because you're there and forge a path in that regard so that other systems can sort of look at that as a model.
absolutely. That's great. Hey, I know when we were getting started, we were talking about, and I see your shirt, the Black Scholars Institute. So I wanna weave in that question to give you an opportunity to plug what you're doing there, what's going on, and maybe even grab some attention of some of this audience that's looking to go to school who maybe would have no idea about the University of Windsor and the Black Scholars Institute. Do you want to spend the last few minutes talking a little bit about that?
Absolutely, yes. So initially it was the Black Studies Institute, which is what you referred to it as before. When I took on the appointment, I changed it and I changed it to
Scholars.
Black Scholars because
Love
I
it.
wanted it to be more inclusive. And so, people have a particular idea about what Black studies is, and that, that means that your subjects need to be Black, right? You're looking at Black ways of life and all of those things, and those are important, and I'm inclusive of that. But I wanted to provide a space also for people who are looking at all sorts of things through a Black lens, right? If so, whether you're looking at stem cell research or say, um, computer technology, if you're looking at it through a Black lens, for me, that is Black scholarship. That is, and I include that as sort of as Black studies. And that's not the popular way that people see it. But in terms of the Black Scholars Institute really opens it up to community scholarship as well. And so for me, my goal is to pull community in,
Mhm.
to scholarship and academic endeavors, but also to make all of our scholarship and academic endeavors accessible to community, right? And so it doesn't sit up here with all the knowledge keepers, but we take it back down to the ground, and disseminate it among the people who it's impacting most. We're trying to give power back, the power of knowledge back to the people, and we are trying to sort of and use it as sort of action-oriented um, drive, right? So that we can actually make some of those changes on the ground for the liberation of folks. So the Black Scholars
Wow,
Institute, Research Institute that does all of that.
that's amazing. It's so needed and it's such a great, and I love the framing of the scholars piece. It's a meaningful word, but a meaningful impact as well. So thinking about, I could just talk to you for all day long, but I know we have to wrap at some point. So I wanted to hear your final thoughts, maybe since this is legacy in motion as well. What legacy do you hope to leave, as you think back on all the things you've been doing, yourself?
Uh, what? So, who was it that said it? I think it was Frederick Douglass that said agitate. I'm a bit of an agitator, right? I have always been somebody who, not a politician, never like in the in crowd. I've sort of always been the loner that did things her own way, and I go into spaces to change things, to
Good.
agitate. And so I want to be known, the legacy I want to leave is as an agitator, but agitator for liberation, somebody who cared, right?
Love
So
that. That's amazing. That says so much. Thank you. Thank you so
yeah.
much for sharing part of your story today and being part of this month and this podcast. I couldn't think of a better guest to have on. So thank you so much. It's been really meaningful, and I know the listeners have probably just walked away with so much content and insights. So thank you very much.
Pleasure. Anytime.
Nice. Awesome. So, for our listeners, if you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with your network. You can find us at coffeewithconvery.com or on your favorite podcast platform. Be sure to also follow us on Instagram for updates and really more inspiring content. This is Coffee with Convery, where we say success doesn't show you how, it's about climbing the corporate ladder. Sometimes it's about building your own jungle gym.